HOA blocked an ambulance at my gate. Then deputies asked one dangerous question. The night the ambulance got blocked at my gate, I thought I was dealing with another HOA argument. I was wrong. A little girl couldn't breathe. HOA president. Vanessa Whitmore stood in the rain claiming she had authority to stop emergency responders from reaching my cabins. Deputies believed her, at first. Then one question changed everything. Who actually owned the road beneath their feet? What started as a fight over 16 lake cabins uncovered a secret that put an entire luxury subdivision on shaky ground. And the deeper I dug, the worse it got. If you enjoy stories about ordinary folks standing their ground with patience, paperwork, and common sense, take a second to subscribe. We've got plenty more HOA, ranch, lake, and land rights stories ahead. Now let me tell you how one gravel road turned an entire community upside down. The first thing I saw was the flashing red light reflecting off the wet iron gate. The second thing I heard was a woman screaming. Not angry screaming, not arguing, the kind of scream that comes from pure fear. I pulled my truck onto the shoulder and killed the engine. Half a dozen vehicles were backed up along Holloway Road. An ambulance sat sideways near the entrance with its emergency lights cutting through the darkness. Two sheriff's deputies stood near the gate. Several people were gathered in the rain, shouting over one another. And standing directly in front of the locked gate was Vanessa Whitmore. Even from 30 yards away, I could recognize her. White raincoat, clipboard tucked under one arm, perfect posture. Like she was posing for a magazine cover instead of blocking emergency responders. I stepped out of the truck. Rain soaked my jacket almost instantly. One of the deputies spotted me first, his shoulders visibly relaxed. "Garrett!" he shouted. The moment he said my name, Vanessa turned around. Her expression changed immediately. Annoyance, then irritation, then something that looked suspiciously like panic. I started walking toward the gate. The screaming came again. This time I could make out the words. "My daughter can't breathe." The voice came from somewhere beyond the entrance. Cabin 11. I knew the voice. Melissa Turner. She'd rented the cabin for a week with her husband and 2 kids. A paramedic slammed his palm against the gate. "Ma'am, we need access now." Vanessa didn't move. "The HOA has implemented temporary emergency control procedures," she said. The paramedic stared at her. "What?" "The property is currently under active compliance review." "I don't care if it's under review," he snapped. "A child is having a medical emergency." Vanessa folded her arms. "Nobody enters until residency verification is completed." For a moment, nobody spoke. I watched one deputy look at the other. Neither seemed to understand what they were hearing. The paramedic stepped forward again. His patience was disappearing. "Are you seriously preventing an ambulance from entering?" "I am enforcing community regulations." The deputy closest to her rubbed rainwater from his face. "Ms. Whitmore, maybe we should—" "No," Vanessa interrupted. The word came out sharp, almost desperate. "The HOA has authority here." Authority. That word again. I had been hearing it for months. Community authority, access authority, compliance authority. Funny thing about authority, people who actually have it rarely need to talk about it. The screaming came again, louder this time. Then coughing, deep, violent, a child struggling for air. The paramedic looked ready to break the lock himself. That's when I reached the gate. Vanessa immediately stepped in front of me. "You are not authorized to interfere." I looked at her. Just looked. Didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't ask questions. My father taught me years ago that silence makes dishonest people uncomfortable. Vanessa shifted slightly. Then she started talking faster. "Always a bad sign. The board voted yesterday. She pointed at the clipboard. We have initiated temporary seizure proceedings involving the cabins. I said nothing. The HOA has assumed management oversight. Still nothing. The deputies are aware of the situation. One of the deputies frowned. No, we're not. Vanessa ignored him. She was watching me, waiting for an argument, waiting for anger, waiting for something she could use. Instead, I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out a ring of keys, and walked toward the lock. Her eyes widened. You can't do that. The deputy looked confused. Why not? Because the HOA is exercising emergency authority. The deputy blinked, then looked at me, then looked at the lock, then looked back at Vanessa. Does the HOA own this gate? Vanessa hesitated. Only for a second. But I noticed. So did the deputy. I slid the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked. Simple. Clean. Final. The gate swung open. The ambulance launched forward immediately, tires throwing gravel, paramedics disappearing into the darkness toward cabin 11. The screaming mother finally stopped. Everyone watched the ambulance race away. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa recovered. You just violated an active HOA order. I closed the gate behind the emergency vehicles. Did I? Her face reddened. You interfered with official enforcement actions. The deputy slowly turned toward her. What enforcement action? The seizure process. You have a court order? No. A county order? No. A sheriff's order? No. Vanessa's jaw tightened. The HOA voted. The deputy stared at her, then looked at me, then back at her. Rain hammered the gravel around us. Finally, I decided to speak. Not to Vanessa, to the deputy. You might want to ask one question before anybody enforces anything. The deputy frowned. What question? I pointed at the wet road beneath his boots. The same gravel road my father and I had maintained for decades. The same road every homeowner in Cedar Ridge Estates used every day. The same road Vanessa had spent months pretending belonged to her. Ask her who owns the road your patrol car is parked on. Silence. Real silence. The kind that changes a conversation. The deputy looked down, then back at Vanessa. The paramedics' truck was now disappearing around the bend toward the cabins. The security guard standing beside Vanessa suddenly looked nervous. Even he seemed interested in the answer. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. It belongs to the community. She answered too quickly. Much too quickly. I nodded slowly. Interesting. Her eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Because I paid property taxes on it 3 weeks ago. Nobody spoke. Not the deputies, not the security guard, not the handful of residents standing nearby. Vanessa's confidence cracked for the first time. Only a little, but I saw it. And once you see a crack, you start wondering how deep it goes. The deputy looked from her to me, then back again. Mr. Holloway, he said carefully, do you have documentation for that? I met his eyes. Every year since my father passed. The deputy nodded slowly. Vanessa immediately stepped forward. This is irrelevant. No, I said quietly. It really isn't. The rain kept falling. The ambulance was gone. The gate was open. And for the first time all night, Vanessa Whitmore looked uncertain. The problem for her wasn't that I had unlocked the gate. The problem was that somebody had finally asked the question she'd been avoiding for months. Who actually owned Holloway Road? And the answer was about to become a very serious problem for a lot of people. The deputies eventually left after taking statements from everyone at the gate. The ambulance remained at cabin 11 for nearly an hour before the little girl was stabilized and transported to the hospital. Vanessa stayed just long enough to regain her composure. Then she climbed into her SUV and drove away without another word. That worried me more than if she had screamed. People like Vanessa usually got louder when things went wrong. When they suddenly became quiet, it meant they were planning something. I locked the gate after the last emergency vehicle left and drove toward the cabins. The road curved along the shoreline exactly as it had for decades. Every turn, every drainage ditch, every patch of gravel. I knew them all by memory. My father had made sure of that. When I was 12 years old, Samuel Holloway handed me a shovel and pointed toward a washout after a spring storm. "Roads don't take care of themselves," he said. "I spent the entire weekend moving gravel. At the time, I thought he was teaching me maintenance. Years later, I realized he was teaching me ownership. My father bought the original 6 acres on Blackwater Lake in 1974. Back then, there was no HOA, no luxury development, no security gates, just fishermen, retirees, and families who wanted a quiet place to spend summers. The first cabin came a year later, the second 3 years after that, then another, and another. By the time I reached adulthood, there were 16 cabins scattered along the shoreline. Nothing fancy, just honest places built by working hands. Families returned year after year. Some of their kids eventually brought their own children. The cabins became part of the lake. So did Holloway Road. My father talked about that road constantly, sometimes too much. At least that's what I thought back then. People focus on buildings, he used to say. They should focus on access. I never fully understood what he meant until much later. After my wife Laura died, I moved back permanently. Cancer had taken her in less than a year. One day, we were planning retirement. The next, I was standing in a hospital hallway, listening to doctors tell me there was nothing left to try. The city became unbearable after that. Every street carried a memory. Every restaurant reminded me of something we had done together. So I came home. The cabins gave me work. The lake gave me quiet. And the road gave me purpose. For 6 years, that was enough. Then Cedar Ridge Estates arrived. Developers bought land north of the shoreline and started building enormous lake houses. Property values exploded. Investors followed. Then came the HOA, and eventually Vanessa Whitmore. The first time I met her, she introduced herself like she was running for office. Perfect smile, perfect clothes, perfect confidence. Within 10 minutes, she was already explaining how the area could be modernized. That word became her favorite. Modernized docks, modernized property standards, modernized community planning. What she really meant was expensive. 3 months after becoming HOA president, she mailed me a letter suggesting I replace several wooden cabin signs because they looked outdated. I ignored it. The next letter complained about guests parking pickup trucks near the shoreline. Ignored that one too. Then came complaints about boat trailers, fire pits, paint colors, outdoor furniture. Each complaint sounded ridiculous by itself. Together they formed a pattern, a slow pressure campaign. One afternoon, she walked onto my property carrying a clipboard. She stopped near cabin 7 and stared at the lake. "Beautiful land," she said. "It is. You ever think about selling?" There it was. The real question. Not signs, not parking, not compliance. Selling. I laughed. "No." She smiled politely. "You answered that pretty quickly. So did you." Her smile faded slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you didn't walk all the way out here to discuss paint colors." For a second, I saw irritation flash across her face. Then it disappeared. That was the day I realized she wasn't interested in managing a neighborhood. She was interested in controlling one. Months passed. The letters continued. The inspections started. Then security cameras appeared near the subdivision entrance. Then survey markers. Then traffic studies. Everything kept coming back to one thing: the road. The more attention Vanessa gave Holloway Road, the more curious I became. Because according to every document my father left behind, there shouldn't have been any confusion. The road belonged to us, always had. Yet somehow Vanessa kept acting as if ownership was merely a technical detail waiting to be corrected. The night after the ambulance incident, I sat alone on the porch of Cabin 1 with a stack of old property files beside me. Most belonged to my father. Some were older than I was. I flipped through them slowly. Tax receipts, maintenance records, utility agreements. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Yet. Then my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a familiar name: Hank Dawson, a retired contractor who lived near the subdivision entrance. I answered immediately. Hank. His voice sounded tense. Garrett, you need to know something. What happened? There was a pause. Then he lowered his voice. I was at a Cedar Ridge board meeting last week. I sat up straighter and... Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. They aren't trying to manage your cabins anymore. What are they trying to do? They're trying to acquire them. The lake suddenly felt a lot quieter. What exactly did you hear? I heard Vanessa tell investors that shoreline expansion couldn't move forward until the Holloway property issue was resolved. Property issue. Interesting choice of words. I looked down at the old paperwork spread across the porch table, then toward the dark outline of Holloway Road disappearing into the trees. For the first time, I started wondering if Vanessa's obsession wasn't about regulations at all. Maybe the cabins were simply standing in the way of something much bigger. And if that was true, the battle that started at the gate was only the beginning. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped at a small diner overlooking the marina. Hank Dawson was already waiting. He looked uncomfortable. That alone got my attention. Hank had spent 30 years supervising construction crews. It took a lot to make him nervous. He slid into the booth across from me. You didn't hear this from me. Usually means I'm about to hear something important. He didn't smile. 3 months ago, I worked a maintenance contract for one of the investors connected to Cedar Ridge. I leaned forward. What kind of investor? Resort development. That wasn't surprising. What came next was... Hank pulled out his phone and showed me an aerial image. Blackwater Lake, the subdivision, the shoreline, my cabins. Red lines had been drawn across the map. Large sections of waterfront property were highlighted, including every acre I owned. I stared at the screen. What is this? A proposed expansion concept. My stomach tightened. There it was. Not suspicion. Proof. The cabins weren't an inconvenience. They were an obstacle. A very expensive obstacle. Where did you get this? They accidentally left it displayed during a planning meeting. I zoomed in. The labels were impossible to miss. Future Marina Village, luxury waterfront lodges, private recreation district. None of those things could be built while 16 fishing cabins occupied the shoreline. Hank pointed at one section. See that? I nodded. It was marked Phase 2, directly on top of Cabin 7 through Cabin 12, the center of my property. They've been discussing this for months. I handed the phone back. Why tell me now? His expression darkened. Because I was at the gate during the ambulance incident. That answer was enough. People might tolerate HOA politics, Most wouldn't tolerate a child struggling to breathe while somebody argued about authority. The following week, Vanessa stopped pretending. The first certified letter arrived on Tuesday. According to Cedar Ridge Estates, several cabins were allegedly creating visual inconsistencies within the surrounding community. The phrase made me laugh, until I reached the next page. Formal compliance review. The second letter arrived 2 days later. Unauthorized rental activity concerns. Then another. Traffic impact evaluation. Then another. Environmental compatibility review. Every accusation sounded official. None of them made sense. But that wasn't the point. The point was volume. Keep sending enough paperwork, and eventually somebody gets exhausted. By Friday, I had received 7 notices. The next attack targeted my guests. A family from Nebraska called me while driving to the lake. The father sounded confused. "Mr. Holloway, we received an email saying your cabins may be facing access restrictions." I sat up immediately. "What email?" He forwarded it while we spoke. The sender was Cedar Ridge Community Compliance Office. I read the message twice. It warned visitors about ongoing property investigations and potential disruptions. Nothing technically false. Everything intentionally misleading. The family still came. 2 other reservations canceled. By the end of the week, I had lost nearly $4,000. Not enough to cripple the business. Enough to send a message. Then Vanessa appeared in person. I found her standing near cabin 3 one afternoon with 2 HOA board members. One of them was taking photographs. The other was writing notes. Neither looked comfortable. Vanessa looked perfectly at home. "What are you doing?" She turned calmly. "Conducting a community review." "On my property?" "It affects surrounding residents." I glanced toward the man with the camera. He immediately lowered it. "Smart move." Vanessa stepped forward. "Garrett, this doesn't have to become unpleasant." That sentence told me everything, because it implied she thought it already belonged to her. "What exactly do you want?" For a second, her mask slipped. "Not much. Just enough. I want progress." There it is. Her eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means this was never about parking, signs, or compliance. The board members exchanged glances. Vanessa noticed. She immediately shifted back into politician mode. "We're trying to improve the community." I looked directly at her. "No." Silence. The board members stopped writing. Even the man with the camera looked interested. I pointed toward the shoreline. "You want the land." Nobody spoke. Vanessa's expression hardened. The fake smile disappeared completely. For the first time, I wasn't looking at an HOA president. I was looking at a developer's partner who had run out of patience. "You should think carefully about your future here." The threat was delivered quietly, almost professionally, which somehow made it worse. I smiled. That seemed to irritate her more than any argument could have. "Funny." "What?" "My father used to say people only threaten things they can't legally take." Her jaw tightened. Then she turned and walked away. The board members followed. One of them glanced back before leaving. An older man. Embarrassed. Uneasy. Like somebody beginning to realize they had joined the wrong side of a fight. I watched their vehicles disappear down Holloway Road, the same road Vanessa seemed increasingly determined to control. That evening, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was different. Not a violation, not a warning, not a review. It was a notice announcing temporary access management measures for upcoming holiday traffic. I read it twice, then a third time. The language was careful. Very careful. But the meaning was clear. The HOA intended to place personnel at my entrance road. Control who entered. Control who left. Control access itself. I looked down the shoreline toward the cabins, then toward the gravel road stretching through the trees. Vanessa wasn't testing boundaries anymore. She was crossing them. And for the first time, it looked like she believed nobody could stop her. The holiday weekend was only 2 weeks away, and something told me that when it arrived, Holloway Road was about to become the center of a much larger fight. I was right. Memorial Day weekend was the busiest stretch of the year for the cabins. Every unit was booked. Families were driving in from Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Washington. That Friday morning started normally. By noon, it was a disaster. I got a call from one of my guests. "Garrett, we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "They won't let us through." I was already reaching for my truck keys. "Who's stopping you?" "The HOA." 10 minutes later, I pulled up to the entrance and immediately saw what they had done. 2 security trucks were parked sideways across Holloway Road. Uniformed guards stood beside portable barricades. A folding table had been set up in the middle of the road, and behind it stood Vanessa Whitmore, like she had been waiting for me. Several vehicles were backed up near the highway. Families, boats, campers, vacationers, people who had driven hundreds of miles only to be stopped by an HOA checkpoint. I stepped out of my truck. Vanessa smiled. "Good afternoon, Garrett." I looked at the barricades, then at the security guards, then at the line of frustrated guests. What exactly is this? A temporary traffic management program. One of the guards handed me a laminated sheet. I read it. Road maintenance fee, traffic impact assessment fee, boating access review fee, temporary entry permit. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "You are charging people to use my road." Vanessa folded her arms. "We're protecting community infrastructure." There it was again. Community infrastructure. She loved phrases that sounded official. The problem was that official-sounding language wasn't ownership. A pickup truck door slammed behind me. One of my guests walked over carrying a reservation confirmation. He looked exhausted. "We've been driving for 8 hours. Vanessa immediately switched into customer service mode. "Sir, we're simply implementing temporary access standards." The man stared at her, then at the fee sheet, then back at her. "This sounds fake." Several people in line nodded. One of the security guards looked away. Vanessa's smile tightened. The HOA board approved these measures. I stepped closer. "The HOA board doesn't own this road." Her expression hardened. "We've already discussed that." "No," I said. "You've avoided discussing it." A brief silence followed. The guests were listening now. So were the guards. Vanessa hated that. People like Vanessa preferred private pressure. Public questions were dangerous. One of the guards cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are we supposed to collect these fees from everyone?" His uncertainty was obvious. Vanessa shot him a look. "Yes." The guard nodded reluctantly. Then I noticed something else. Several new signs had been installed along the fence line. Cedar Ridge Access Control Zone, Authorized Community Corridor, Private Management Area. Every sign implied ownership. None of them actually claimed it. Careful wording. Very careful. I walked toward the nearest sign, examined it, then looked back at Vanessa. "You know what your biggest problem is?" She smiled. "Please tell me." "You keep acting like ownership and control are the same thing." The smile disappeared. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her folder. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to discuss this." She handed me a packet. Official Notice of Property Compliance Review. The document was nearly 20 pages long. I flipped through it. Fire safety concerns, occupancy concerns, environmental concerns, drainage concerns, infrastructure concerns. Everything was phrased as though disaster was imminent, and every recommendation pointed toward one conclusion: temporary closure. My stomach tightened, not because I believed the document, because I understood exactly what it was designed to do: scare guests, reduce revenue, create pressure, force a sale. The guests nearby were reading over my shoulder. One woman looked worried. "Are the cabins being shut down?" Vanessa answered before I could. "The review is ongoing." That was enough. The woman immediately stepped back. Fear worked. Vanessa knew it. I folded the packet. "You're making a mistake." She smiled again. "No, Garrett. I'm solving a problem." I looked past her toward the shoreline, toward the cabins my father spent decades building, then back at the barricades, the fake fees, the signs, the security guards, the compliance packet. For the first time, Vanessa wasn't pretending to influence Holloway Road. She was behaving as if she already owned it, and somehow she believed nobody would challenge her. A family finally paid the fee just to get through, then another, and another. I watched cash change hands on property that didn't belong to Cedar Ridge Estates. The security company was documenting vehicles, recording names, collecting money, all under Vanessa's authority. That was when something clicked. She wasn't acting confident anymore. She was acting desperate. Confident people don't build checkpoints. Desperate people do. I got back into my truck. Vanessa watched me carefully. "Leaving already?" "For now," she nodded. "I thought you might." The implication was clear. She thought she was winning. Maybe she believed the pressure would eventually break me. Maybe she believed enough paperwork and intimidation would force me off the shoreline. What she didn't realize was that every sign she installed, every fee she collected, every checkpoint she operated, created another piece of evidence, and evidence has a habit of surviving long after arrogance runs out. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The barricades remained in place. Guests continued paying fees. Security guards continued taking notes. Vanessa continued smiling. The problem for her was simple. If she truly owned the road, she wouldn't need to pretend. And sooner or later, somebody was going to ask her to prove it. The problem was that proof takes time. Pressure doesn't. Vanessa understood that better than most people. Within days of the holiday weekend, the checkpoint operation expanded. The security trucks stayed. The fees stayed. The signs stayed. And the paperwork multiplied. Every morning seemed to bring another certified envelope. One notice claimed several cabins were creating traffic density concerns. Another claimed potential environmental impact issues. A third alleged deficiencies in emergency access coordination. None of the accusations matched. None of them pointed to a specific violation. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was volume. Create enough confusion and eventually people stop asking questions. My guests certainly did. The first cancellation arrived on Monday, then 3 more on Tuesday. By Friday, I had lost nearly a quarter of the month's bookings. Most of the emails sounded similar. "We love the property, but we're concerned about the legal situation. We don't want to get caught in a dispute. We'll rebook once everything is resolved." Exactly what Vanessa wanted. Not closure, pressure, financial pressure. One afternoon, I received a call from a family in Colorado. The father sounded embarrassed. "Mr. Holloway, we got an HOA advisory." I already knew what came next. What did it say? That access restrictions could affect cabin operations. I closed my eyes. There it was again. Access. Every complaint eventually circled back to the road. The family canceled 30 minutes later. That evening, I drove past the Cedar Ridge office. The parking lot was full. Inside, lights were still on. People were working late. For an HOA supposedly focused on community appearance, they seemed unusually obsessed with my property. The next morning, things escalated again. 3 inspectors arrived at Cabin 6. They wore matching polo shirts and carried clipboards. One examined drainage ditches. Another photographed electrical boxes. The third measured distances between structures. I watched for nearly 20 minutes before walking over. "What exactly are you inspecting?" The oldest inspector lowered his clipboard. His expression suggested he was tired of the entire assignment. "Compliance review." "Compliance with what?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Finally, he sighed. "Honestly?" I nodded. "We've been instructed to evaluate whether these cabins qualify as non-conforming commercial rentals." That got my attention. Meaning someone wants grounds to recommend temporary closure. There it was. The first honest answer I'd heard in weeks. Not signs, not parking, not traffic. Closure. The inspector glanced toward the road. A white SUV was parked near the entrance. Vanessa's. Then he lowered his voice. "For what it's worth, these cabins are in better condition than most properties I inspect." "Then why are you here?" He gave a humorless smile. "You already know the answer." Yes. I did. The inspectors left shortly afterward. Vanessa remained, watching, always watching, as if she expected the cabins to surrender on their own. The following week brought another wave of notices. This time they targeted occupancy. One claimed excessive guest turnover. Another suggested underutilization of lake resources. I read both documents twice. The first said too many guests were arriving. The second implied not enough guests were arriving. The contradiction was almost funny. Almost. That night I spread every notice across the table inside Cabin 1. Weeks of complaints, emails, inspection reports, access warnings, fee schedules, compliance reviews, hundreds of pages. I started reading them carefully, not emotionally, like my father used to read contracts, line by line, word by word, pattern by pattern. And eventually, something stood out. Every single document referenced Community Access Authority. Every one. Not a single document referenced ownership. Not one. The distinction was subtle, but important. Authority, control, management, oversight. Those words appeared constantly. Ownership never did. I gathered the papers into separate piles, then checked again. Same result. Vanessa was talking around something, avoiding something. The question was why. My phone rang shortly after midnight. Rachel McKenna. I hadn't spoken to the retired attorney in months. "Garrett. You picked an interesting time to call. I heard about the checkpoints. News traveled fast around Blackwater Lake. Then you've heard enough." "No," she said. "I don't think I have." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" There was a pause. Then Rachel asked a question nobody else had asked. "Have you pulled the county records yet?" I looked at the stack of notices covering the table. "No." "You should." "Why?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Because if they're working this hard to avoid the word ownership, there's usually a reason." I sat back in my chair. Outside, the lake was quiet. Inside, the paperwork suddenly looked different. Not like evidence against me, like evidence against someone else. Rachel spoke again. Garrett, before you respond to another notice, before you argue with Vanessa, before you spend $1 fighting back. What? Find out exactly what the county records say. After the call ended, I looked down at the mountain of paperwork one last time. Weeks of accusations, weeks of pressure, weeks of intimidation, and hidden inside all of it was a single question nobody seemed willing to answer. If Cedar Ridge Estates controlled Holloway Road, why was Vanessa so careful never to claim she owned it? The next morning, I decided to find out. The county records office sat 30 miles away in Sandpoint. Most people only visited the building when something had gone wrong. Divorces, property disputes, estate problems. The parking lot was half empty when I arrived. Inside, the smell of old paper and copier toner hadn't changed in 20 years. Martha Reynolds was sitting behind the counter. She looked up from a file and immediately recognized me. Garrett Holloway. I smiled. Morning, Martha. She adjusted her glasses. I hear you've become very popular with the HOA. News traveled even faster than I thought. Something like that. Her expression changed. Less humor, more concern. What can I help you find? I placed several of Vanessa's notices on the counter. I need everything connected to Holloway Road. Martha studied the documents. Her eyebrows slowly rose. Then she stood up. You might want a bigger table. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a records room surrounded by maps, plats, easements, tax filings, and development approvals. The deeper we dug, the stranger things became. The first discovery was simple. Property taxes. Every year since 1987. Same parcel, same road, same ownership. Samuel Holloway, then Garrett Holloway. No HOA, no developer, no transfer, no dispute, nothing. I wasn't surprised. The tax records confirmed exactly what I already believed. But Martha wasn't finished. Look at this. She slid a development packet across the table. Cedar Ridge Estates, original subdivision approval, 3 years before Vanessa arrived. I opened the file. Hundreds of pages, environmental reviews, traffic studies, utility approvals, emergency service requirements. Then something caught my eye. A highlighted paragraph. Martha pointed directly at it. Read that line. I did. Twice, then a third time. Existing private access agreement with Holloway Road required for continued development compliance. I looked up. What exactly does that mean? Martha folded her arms. It means the subdivision couldn't have been approved without access through your road. The room suddenly felt smaller. Keep going. She handed me another file. Utility easements, electric, fiber optic, water service. Every single one crossed or depended on Holloway Road. Every single one referenced access permissions, not ownership, permissions. I felt something shift. For weeks I'd been defending myself. Now I was starting to understand the larger picture. This wasn't just about cabins. This wasn't even primarily about cabins. The entire subdivision appeared connected to my road. Martha opened another folder. Here's the interesting part. The document inside was older than the others. A temporary development access agreement, signed by the original developer, recorded with the county. I read the language carefully. The developer acknowledged continued private ownership of Holloway Road. There it was, in black and white. No ambiguity, no loophole, no confusion. The road belonged to my family, always had. The developer knew it. The county knew it. The paperwork knew it. So why was Vanessa behaving like ownership didn't matter? I already suspected the answer. Now I needed proof. Martha was reading another document when she suddenly stopped. Huh. I looked up. What? She slid the page across the table. County Emergency Access Review, part of the subdivision approval process. I scanned the report, then froze. The final section outlined emergency vehicle requirements: fire trucks, ambulances, utility crews, evacuation planning. Every requirement depended on one access corridor: Holloway Road. I read it again, then leaned back in my chair. You're telling me emergency services depend on this road? Martha nodded. Looks that way. The ambulance incident flashed through my mind. Vanessa blocking access, claiming authority, stopping responders. If she understood these documents, then what she'd done at the gate was even worse than I thought. And if she didn't understand them, that might be even more dangerous. By late afternoon, copies of documents covered half the table. The evidence kept pointing in the same direction. Ownership wasn't the issue. Dependency was. Cedar Ridge Estates didn't own Holloway Road. They needed Holloway Road. There was a huge difference. I left the records office carrying a box full of copies. The drive home felt different. For the first time since the checkpoints appeared, I wasn't reacting. I was learning, and learning changes fights. My phone rang before I reached the lake. Rachel McKenna. I answered immediately. Tell me you found something. I looked at the stack of documents on the passenger seat. I think I found a lot more than something. Rachel was quiet. That usually meant she was paying attention. I spent 10 minutes summarizing everything: tax records, development approvals, emergency access agreements, utility easements. When I finished, she didn't respond right away. Finally, she spoke. Garrett. Her tone had changed, more serious. How serious is this? Another pause. Then Rachel said the last thing I expected. I think your HOA problem may be turning into a subdivision problem. I frowned. What does that mean? It means I want to review every document before you do anything else. That bad? Worse. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Why? Rachel exhaled slowly. Because if what you're describing is accurate, Cedar Ridge may depend on rights they never actually acquired. Silence. Then one final sentence. And if that's true, Vanessa isn't protecting the subdivision. She paused. She's protecting a very expensive mistake. The next morning, Rachel was sitting at the table inside cabin 1 before I finished making coffee. Boxes of county records covered every available surface: tax filings, subdivision approvals, utility agreements, emergency access reviews. Rachel had already highlighted sections in 3 different binders. That alone told me something serious was coming. She looked up. Start with this one. She handed me a development approval packet, the same file Martha had shown me. Only now Rachel had flagged a specific section buried deep inside the appendix. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The language was straightforward. Cedar Ridge Estates had been approved subject to continued access through Holloway Road. Not temporary access, not assumed access. Continued access. Rachel tapped the page. That's the condition that allowed the subdivision to move forward. I looked at her. They built the entire community based on this? Looks that way. I sat back slowly. The implications were starting to pile up. What happens if that condition doesn't exist? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened another folder. Lender disclosures, development financing documents. I recognized the company names: banks, investment groups, construction lenders, the people who funded Cedar Ridge. Rachel pointed to a paragraph. Read that. The document referenced permanent roadway access supporting residential occupancy and future expansion. permanent. I looked up. They don't have permanent ownership. No. They never did. No. I stared at the paperwork. For months, Vanessa had acted like the road was hers. But the real problem wasn't ownership. It was dependency. Every house, every utility line, every emergency response plan, every future expansion proposal. Everything depended on Holloway Road remaining available. The entire subdivision was balanced on an assumption. Rachel leaned forward. Now read this. The next document was even worse. Utility infrastructure agreements, electrical service, internet service, water delivery routes, maintenance access. Every system crossed the same corridor. My corridor, and every agreement referenced permissions granted by the property owner. Not the HOA, not the developer. The owner. Me. For the first time, I understood why Vanessa had become so aggressive. If investors discovered the reality behind those documents, questions would follow. A lot of questions. Questions she couldn't answer. The phone rang before either of us spoke again. It was Hank Dawson. His voice was urgent. "Garrett, you need to see this." 20 minutes later, we met at the marina. Hank handed me a folded brochure. Future Cedar Ridge Waterfront Expansion. The cover showed luxury condominiums, private docks, restaurants, retail space. I flipped through the pages, then stopped. A color rendering filled 2 entire pages. The future expansion area. The location looked familiar because it should have. It was my property. Cabins, shoreline, boat docks, everything. The development plan simply assumed those things would disappear. Rachel studied the brochure. "Where did you get this?" "Investor presentation." Hank looked disgusted. "They were handing them out at a private meeting last month." I turned another page. Projected valuation increase. Future waterfront acquisition phase. Future waterfront acquisition. Interesting wording. Not ownership. Not purchased. Acquisition. They still needed something. Rachel noticed it too. They knew. What? They knew they didn't own the land. I looked at her. She pointed toward the phrase. If ownership was settled, they wouldn't call it acquisition. She was right. The brochure wasn't a development plan. It was evidence. Evidence that someone expected control before they possessed it. That evening, we returned to Cabin 1 and kept digging. Near sunset, Rachel found the document. The document nobody seemed to have read. At least not recently. It was buried inside a supplemental approval package filed years earlier. Only 3 pages long, easy to overlook, easy to ignore. The final paragraph changed everything. In the event access permissions through Holloway Road become unavailable, occupancy compliance for Cedar Ridge Estates shall be subject to county review. Silence filled the room. Rachel slowly lowered the paper. I felt my pulse quicken. Not because I planned to block access. I never would. Because the document revealed the truth. The subdivision wasn't merely connected to Holloway Road. It legally depended on Holloway Road. The difference was enormous. Rachel looked directly at me. "Garrett." "What?" "I don't think Vanessa understands how dangerous this is." I wasn't sure. Part of me believed she understood perfectly. Another part wondered if she'd spent so long pretending to have authority that she'd started believing it herself. Either way, the reality remained. The HOA never owned the road. The developers never owned the road. The lenders never owned the road. They were all relying on a property they did not control. And now I had the paperwork proving it. I looked out the window toward the entrance road, disappearing into the trees. For months, Vanessa had tried to convince everyone that Holloway Road belonged to Cedar Ridge. The truth was much worse. Cedar Ridge belonged to Holloway Road. The only question left was what would happen when Vanessa realized I finally knew it. Rachel answered that question before I could. Nothing. I looked at her. What? Do nothing. That wasn't the answer I expected. We had the documents, the approvals, the easement records, the development conditions. For the first time since the conflict started, the facts were on our side. Yet Rachel was telling me to sit still. She closed the binder. Garrett, if you confront Vanessa now, she'll get careful. I hated that she was right. Then what do? We let her keep talking. 3 days later, I followed her advice. No emails, no complaints, no threats, no demands. I stopped responding completely. The effect was immediate. Vanessa became more aggressive. The first sign appeared at the entrance the following week. Cedar Ridge Controlled Access Corridor. The wording made Rachel laugh. That's not ownership language. It sounds like ownership. Exactly. Another security station appeared 2 days later. More fees, more checkpoints, more forms, more records. Every action created documentation. Every document created evidence. Every piece of evidence moved us closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Vanessa seemed convinced my silence meant surrender. One afternoon, I stopped at the marina for fuel and overheard her speaking with 2 real estate investors near the docks. She didn't notice me at first. The shoreline expansion is still on schedule, she said. One of the investors frowned. What about the cabin owner? Vanessa smiled. The situation is being resolved. I slowed down. The investor nodded. And once it's resolved? She pointed toward the northern shoreline. My team can finally move into Phase 2. Phase 2. The same phrase from the brochure. The same phase that erased my cabins from the map. I continued walking as if I hadn't heard anything. Vanessa noticed me seconds later. Her smile disappeared. Garrett. Vanessa. The investors suddenly found somewhere else to be. Interesting. Apparently even they didn't want to be standing there. Vanessa crossed her arms. You've been unusually quiet. I shrugged. Busy. She studied me, trying to figure out whether I knew something, trying to determine whether she'd missed a threat. There wasn't one. That was the point. Silence makes people nervous, especially controlling people. She stepped closer. You know, this could all end very easily. There it was, the sales pitch. I waited. You could sell. I almost laughed. Months of inspections, months of fees, months of threats, and we had finally arrived at honesty. I thought this was about safety. Her expression tightened. This community has a future. So do the cabins. Not like Cedar Ridge. There it was again. The arrogance, the certainty, the belief that newer automatically meant better. I smiled. That seemed to irritate her. You seem awfully confident lately. I nodded. So do you. For the first time, she didn't answer. That tiny moment of silence told me something. She was feeling pressure, too. Good. Because pressure causes mistakes, and mistakes create evidence. The biggest mistake arrived 4 days later. I woke up to find orange notices taped to every cabin door. Emergency HOA Enforcement Review. The title alone was ridiculous. The contents were worse. According to the notice, Cedar Ridge Estates was initiating temporary seizure authority over the cabin properties due to unresolved compliance concerns. Temporary seizure authority. Rachel read the notice twice before shaking her head. They actually put this in writing. Is that good? It's spectacular. I looked at her. How is this spectacular? She pointed to the wording. Because they still aren't claiming ownership. I read it again. She was right. Authority, control, management, oversight. The same words. Always the same words. Never ownership. The notices triggered exactly what Vanessa intended. Panic. My phone rang constantly. Guests wanted refunds. Future renters wanted answers. Families worried about being removed from their cabins. By sunset, I had lost another $6,000 in reservations. Vanessa probably considered that a victory. What she didn't realize was that every notice strengthened our position. Every false claim, every fee, every checkpoint, every seizure threat. The paper trail was becoming enormous. Then came the call that changed everything. Rachel sounded unusually serious. Garrett, sit down. That got my attention. What happened? I finished reviewing the financing records. I lowered myself into a chair. And? There was a pause. Then she said something that made the room feel colder. The lenders. What about them? They appear to have approved portions of the development based on assumptions regarding permanent roadway access. I frowned. Meaning? Meaning they may have believed Cedar Ridge controlled rights they never actually acquired. I stared at the wall. The implications hit immediately. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. Rachel continued. If outside parties start asking questions about those assumptions, the subdivision could have a serious problem. How serious? Another pause. Longer this time. Then Rachel answered. Serious enough that Vanessa might be willing to do almost anything to avoid those questions. The line went quiet. I looked out the window toward Holloway Road. The checkpoints were still operating. The signs were still standing. The fees were still being collected. Vanessa was still pretending she controlled something she didn't own. The difference now was simple. I finally understood why, and people make their biggest mistakes when they're protecting something they're afraid of losing. The county hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. For months, Vanessa had controlled the narrative. In a few days, she was going to have to answer questions. And for the first time since this started, she wouldn't be the one asking them. The county hearing began at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. By 8:30, the parking lot was already full. Residents from Cedar Ridge Estates stood in small groups holding coffee cups and whispering to one another. Some looked annoyed. Others looked worried. Most looked confused. That made sense. For months, Vanessa had framed the situation as a problem caused by me, a difficult cabin owner, a compliance issue, a threat to community standards. What most residents didn't know was that the conversation was about to change completely. Rachel and I walked into the hearing room carrying 3 binders. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes later with 2 attorneys. She looked confident, at least from a distance. But I noticed something interesting. She kept checking her phone, over and over. People do that when they're waiting for bad news. The county commissioner called the meeting to order exactly at 9. The first hour belonged to Vanessa's side. One attorney spoke about safety concerns. Another discussed traffic management. They referenced inspections, compliance reviews, occupancy concerns, infrastructure strain. Every argument sounded polished. Every argument avoided the same subject. Ownership. Rachel noticed it too. She leaned toward me. They're dancing around it. I nodded. Because they had to. The commissioner eventually turned toward our table. Ms. McKenna. Rachel stood calmly. No dramatic opening. No emotional speech. Just a binder and a simple question. Before discussing compliance concerns, shouldn't we determine who actually controls the road at the center of this dispute? The room immediately became quieter. Vanessa stopped checking her phone. Rachel placed 3 documents in front of the commissioner. Property tax records, recorded plats, ownership filings. The commissioner reviewed them carefully, then looked up. These indicate Holloway Road remains privately owned. Rachel nodded. Correct. One of Vanessa's attorneys stood immediately. The association exercises operational authority over access management. Rachel didn't even look at him. Operational authority is not ownership. Several people in the audience exchanged glances. The distinction mattered, and suddenly everyone understood why. Rachel opened the second binder. Development approvals, utility agreements, emergency access reviews, page after page, document after document. Everyone pointed toward the same conclusion. Cedar Ridge Estates depended on Holloway Road. The commissioner adjusted his glasses. Are these county records? They are. He looked toward Vanessa's attorneys. Neither answered immediately. Mistake. Silence is dangerous when paperwork is sitting on the table. The commissioner continued reading, then stopped. What is this? Rachel stepped forward. A subdivision approval condition. The commissioner read aloud. Continued access through Holloway Road required for development compliance. The room shifted. Not physically, emotionally. People were starting to realize this wasn't a disagreement about cabins. It was a dependency issue. Rachel opened the third binder. This was the one that mattered most. Financing disclosures, lender documents, expansion plans, investor materials. The commissioner studied several pages before looking up again. His expression had changed. So the subdivision was developed based upon continued roadway access? Rachel answered immediately. Yes. And the roadway was never transferred? No. The commissioner looked toward Vanessa. For the first time all morning, she appeared uncomfortable. One of the utility representatives raised his hand. Commissioner, if these records are accurate, our service agreements also depend on that corridor. Another voice followed. The county fire chief. Our emergency access plans do as well. A low wave of whispers spread across the room. Residents started talking among themselves. Questions, concerns, confusion. The narrative was slipping away from Vanessa. Fast. Then Rachel revealed the final document. The emergency access review. The same one Martha had shown me. The same one connected to the ambulance incident. The commissioner read it carefully, then very slowly closed the folder. The room became completely silent. He turned toward Vanessa. Not her attorneys. Her. Ms. Whitmore. She straightened in her chair. Yes? The commissioner folded his hands. His next question landed like a hammer. Did Cedar Ridge Estates operate checkpoints and collect fees on privately owned property? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped. The commissioner waited. So did everyone else. This was the moment. The one Rachel had predicted. The point where facts become impossible to avoid. Vanessa looked toward her attorneys. Neither helped. Because there was no answer. Not a good one. Not a legal one. Not a believable one. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Long enough for every resident in the room to understand exactly what was happening. The loudest person at Blackwater Lake had finally run out of words. One homeowner stood up near the back. A man I recognized from Cedar Ridge. Wait a minute. Everyone turned. You're saying we've been paying road fees to an HOA that doesn't own the road? Nobody answered. Because nobody needed to. The documents already had. The commissioner finally broke the silence. I believe this board has heard enough. For months, Vanessa had controlled the conversation. In less than an hour, that control disappeared. Not because of anger, not because of threats, because of records, because of signatures, because of paperwork. And as the hearing adjourned, I realized something important. The fight wasn't ending. It was changing. Because now everyone knew the truth, and the truth was about to become very expensive. The first county order arrived less than 24 hours after the hearing. All HOA checkpoint operations on Holloway Road were suspended immediately. The barricades disappeared the next morning. The security trucks were gone by noon. By sunset, the signs had vanished too. Funny how quickly authority disappears when someone finally asks for documentation. The second wave hit even harder. Insurance companies started sending letters to Cedar Ridge homeowners, requests for clarification, requests for disclosures, requests regarding roadway access representations. Most residents didn't understand the legal language. They understood the panic. My phone rang constantly, not from renters, from homeowners, people who had spent months believing Vanessa. One man called asking whether emergency vehicles could still reach his house. A young couple wanted to know if their mortgage was affected. An older resident asked whether the subdivision had lied during the purchase process. I answered honestly, I don't know, because I didn't. What I did know was that none of this had to happen. The road had never been the problem. The deception was. 3 days later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. By evening, 2 board members had resigned. The first was an accountant. The second was the same board member who had followed Vanessa around taking photographs at my cabins. Neither wanted their names attached to what came next. The biggest surprise arrived that weekend. Richard Cole, a retired teacher and longtime board member, knocked on my cabin door carrying a cardboard box. You got a minute? I invited him inside. The box was full of HOA records, emails, meeting notes, internal memorandums. Some were routine, others weren't. Rachel arrived an hour later and began reading through everything. Halfway through the stack, she stopped, then smiled. Well, I knew that expression. What did you find? She handed me an email. The sender was Vanessa Whitmore. The subject line read, Shoreline Optimization Strategy. I read it slowly. Future redevelopment opportunities, acquisition planning, pressure options, rental viability concerns. There it was. Not safety, not compliance, not community standards. The entire campaign had been documented in her own words. Rachel laughed once. Short and disbelieving, she actually wrote this down. The email wasn't illegal. It was worse. It proved intent. Months of pretending collapsed into one document. The cabins had never been the issue. The shoreline was. The following week, the county scheduled a special review meeting. The room was even more crowded than the first hearing. This time, nobody came to discuss cabin compliance. They came for answers. The county commissioner opened the session with a brief statement. Then he read the findings. Unauthorized fee collection, improper checkpoint operations, false compliance notices, misrepresentation of authority. Every sentence seemed to make the room quieter. Vanessa sat beside her attorney. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the smile. She looked exhausted. For months, she had controlled every conversation. Now she couldn't control any of them. A homeowner stood up. Then another. Then another. Questions came from every direction. Why were fees collected? Who approved the checkpoints? Why were residents never informed? What happened with the ambulance incident? No one wanted speeches anymore. They wanted explanations. The commissioner finally announced the county's decision. Cedar Ridge Estates would be prohibited from exercising authority over Holloway Road and the cabin properties. An external audit would review HOA actions. Further reviews would examine development disclosures and collected fees. The room erupted. Not with cheering, with relief. People finally understood what had happened. Vanessa didn't argue. She didn't object. She didn't speak at all. The loudest person at Blackwater Lake had become the quietest. A month later, the HOA settled. Every violation notice was withdrawn. Collected access fees were refunded. Formal recognition documents acknowledged my ownership of Holloway Road. New access agreements were signed for utilities, emergency services, and maintenance crews. Fair agreements, reasonable agreements, the kind that should have existed from the beginning. Vanessa resigned shortly afterward. No announcement, no farewell speech. Just gone. The investors abandoned their shoreline expansion plans within weeks. Apparently, luxury development becomes much harder when the paperwork doesn't support the dream. By late summer, the cabins were full again. Families returned. Reservations recovered. The little girl from the ambulance night came back with her parents. I watched her run along the shoreline, chasing frogs while her mother laughed from the dock. No checkpoints, no barricades, no security guards, just cabins, lake water, and a gravel road stretching through the trees. One morning I walked Holloway Road before sunrise, something my father used to do. The road looked exactly the same as it always had, which felt appropriate, because despite everything, nothing about the truth had changed. Only people's understanding of it. My father spent years teaching me lessons I didn't fully appreciate when I was younger. Tax records, property lines, easements, maintenance agreements. Most of it sounded painfully boring at the time. Now I understood. Ownership isn't about power. It's not about titles. It's not about who speaks the loudest at meetings. Ownership is about proof, about records, about facts that remain standing after the noise disappears. Vanessa spent months trying to control something she never owned. In the end, the road didn't defeat her. The paperwork did. And when the noise finally stopped, the truth was still standing exactly where it had always been, right in the middle of Holloway Road.
If there one lesson I take from this story, it's that some of the most important things in life are easy to overlook when everything seems to be working fine. My father spent years teaching me about this: assessment, tax records, and ownership. Back then, it sounded like pouring paperwork, but when the result comes, the records matter more than opinions, assumptions, or whoever happened to be speaking the loudest. The judges were there the whole time. Someone just had to be willing to read it. There also something comforting about knowing that steady patterns still matter. Not every problem is solved by a just harder. Sometimes it's solved by staying calm, gathering the facts, and letting the judge speak for itself. In the end, what the matter most wasn't winning an adjustment. It was protecting something, what resolving and making sure families could keep enjoy a play that means something to them. I love to hear from you. Had you ever had a situation where paperwork, records, or simple fact ending up making all the difference? If so, drop a yes in the comment or share your own HOA properties or neighbor story. I read as many of them as I can. And if you enjoy story about ordinary people standing there rare with patterns, common sense, and a little determination. Consider surprising. We got plenty more HOA, rent, lake, and land right story coming up, and I'll be glad to have you along for the next one.